And welcome in. It is Fifth Avenue Faceoff. Hi, I'm Chris Mack at 93.7 The Fan. How are you? I'm well. Interested to talk about each of the 8 teams that were eliminated in the first round of the Stanley Cup playoffs. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. We're going to bounce around a lot. We're going to bounce around from Boston to New York to Minnesota to Colorado to Tampa to Long Island, to LA, to Winnipeg, all over North America in an attempt to find out what happened to each of these 8 teams this season and in the first round in particular that led to their elimination. The Bruins, the Rangers, the Wild, the Avs, the Lightning, the Isles, the Kings, and the Jets. And find out where their off seasons go, because I think that gives you an inkling and an idea of how the Penguins' offseason may be handled, at least in relation to these 8 teams, right? This is a quarter of the league that was eliminated in the first round. The Penguins didn't get there, but now these 8 teams will certainly affect what the Penguins do when the offseason really does start to hit mid to late June after the Stanley Cup finals are over and leading into the draft and then free agency in early July. So, with no further ado, we are going to bounce, like I said, all over North America. Scott Billeck from Winnipeg, Andrew Knoll in LA, Stefen Rosner on Long Island, I should say, Erik Erlendsson down in Tampa, Evan Rawal in Colorado, Jessi Pierce in Minnesota, Shaun Morash in New York. But we start with our guy, Scott McLaughlin, on what happened to the Bruins. And to get us started, as we take a look back at not just the first round, but the season as a whole for every team that went out in the first round, an Odyssey brother of mine, Odyssey colleague of mine from up in Beantown, WEEI, Scott McLaughlin. Scott, how are you today, man? And how's Boston handling things given the way the Bruins went out in the first round?
I'm good. I think the city as a whole is still pretty stunned, and the Celtics now being on the verge of elimination is not helping matters up here. So
True.
Yeah. So what was once a really promising spring is looking pretty bleak for Boston right now.
Well, what was it? Because the Bruins looked like this unstoppable juggernaut. And granted, we've seen that a couple times in the last decade or so, right? Where teams like the Lightning a few years ago have a remarkable regular season, and then they get to the playoffs. The Lightning were swept out in their case, right? A few years ago. The Bruins get bounced by a team that just barely got in the Panthers. Was it... I hate to use the term rust versus rest, but was it the Bruins not having to play a lot of high stakes hockey down the stretch and they came in dull and Florida was sharp? Was it a tactical mistake? A first year head coach for the Bruins in this case, not pushing the right buttons against the Panthers. From where you sit, what went wrong?
A little bit of all the above. Kind of broke down at every level. I do think the rest versus rust thing, I think that comes into play a little bit, especially games 1 and 2. I thought the Panthers looked like just a far more aggressive, ready team. Bruins seemed to not really be ready for playoff hockey, but I thought they got that out of their system, and they went down to Florida for games 3 and 4, played really well, took control of those games, took control of the series. They're up 3-1. Like at that point, that they're into the swing of it, that they're playing playoff hockey. So how it all went wrong after that in games 5 through 7, to me at that point, like not really playing meaningful hockey or whatever, that's kind of gone as an excuse. You're 5 games into a series at that point.
You better wake up.
Yeah, so they had a lot of defensive breakdowns that weren't there all year, just some terrible turnovers. Part of that is absolutely a credit to the Panthers. They're a great forechecking team. I think people are seeing that in their second round series against Toronto as well. But some of it was unforced errors. Some of it was just boneheaded plays, just blind passes into the middle of their own zone. 2 defensemen getting stuck below the goal line, like things that just weren't there all year, that really weren't forced by Florida and were just self-inflicted wounds. The goaltending certainly didn't hold up. They had really like historically great goaltending all year. Linus Ullmark, we know he was dealing with something. He claims he was hurt, not injured. He says it didn't affect his play, but whatever it was, his play certainly declined as the series went on, especially in games 5 and 6. So that's a factor. They have to go to Jeremy Swayman cold in game 7.
Yeah. How do you think Jim Montgomery handled the goaltending situation late in the series?
I would say not well. And I think he even said it himself this week at his breakup press conference. He said he regretted not going to Swayman earlier. And, look, playoff rotations are very rare, right? Every team throughout hockey history generally picks a number one and rides them. But in this case, the rotation they had really for the last 4 months of the season was incredible. Every game, it was Ullmark, great game. Swayman, great game. Ullmark, great game. Swayman, and just kept going. So to then, decide that you're just going to ride Ullmark in the playoffs, especially when he's dealing with something, however minor they say it is, it was an odd decision. And I think they stuck with him at least one game too long. He struggles in game 5. He has that turnover in overtime. That really seemed like the time to go to Swayman up 3-2. And, they went back to Ullmark, and he really struggled in game 6.
Is this team aging out, Scott? And I guess the double-barreled angle of that question is, will Patrice Bergeron be back?
Yeah, that's now the big question of the offseason, just like it was last offseason. I think David Krejci is probably the one who's more likely to retire. Okay. Bergeron, I lean towards him probably retiring, but I think it's closer to 50-50. I think I got the impression, after game 7 and then on breakup day that he's legitimately undecided and, really wants to take some time to make sure he makes the right decision. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, he's going to be 38. He didn't finish the season healthy. Last game of the regular season suffered a herniated disc in his back. He's dealt with other injuries in recent years. So, it could be time where he just, the physical toll has, added up and it might be time for him.
How are they ready, I guess, to look at this, Don Sweeney in a different way in how they construct the roster, especially if Bergeron and Krejci should both move on with their life's work. They're younger on the back end, obviously, than they are up front, but they've still got David Pasternak's not going anywhere. Do they look to perhaps, and I thought they did a nice job at the deadline, obviously, leading up to the deadline and building out the blue line. Do they start to look at this because of their goaltending, because of the blue line, as we've got to maybe invest more resources in the back end? You've already got Lindholm on a no move clause, right? And a big long extension to go with McAvoy. Do they start to look at constructing things a little bit differently? And is this maybe, to bring it back to a Penguin-centered question, is this sort of the rebuild on the fly that they've struggled to pull off here in Pittsburgh?
Yeah, I think there's going to have to be turnover and some sort of resetting, not only because, if Bergeron and Krejci retire, that's an obvious reset just for the franchise as a whole and anyways, but also their cap situation. They have very little cap space, and between unrestricted and restricted free agents, they have 11 free agents. So they obviously can't keep everyone. They're going to have to maybe trade away some guys if they want to keep, even 3 or 4 of those free agents. So there's going to be a lot of turnover. They, like you said, they do have a solid foundation on the back end with McAvoy, Lindholm, Brendan Carlo in there as well. Mm-hmm. They have the goalies. They might, if you're talking about freeing up money, they might even consider trading one of them away to address holes elsewhere.
I know a team that might be interested.
Yeah, there you go. But yeah, up front, they'll certainly have work to do, especially at the center position. I think they feel like they probably found one of their top 2 centers of the future with Pavel Zacha. Mm-hmm. That was a trade that really worked out well for them, but they would have to find another one because, Charlie Coyle has moved up in the past, but he's limited offensively. So ideally he stays as your third line center.
So no first or second round picks this year or next year, no third round pick next year either. You mentioned the lack of available cap space until they get some decisions, especially on Bergeron and Krejci and what they may be able to do. What's the biggest, I guess, the biggest priority for Sweeney, the GM this offseason, and for the organization as a whole? Is it just are they kind of stuck in a holding pattern until they get an answer on Bergeron and Krejci, or can they start to push forward towards July 1st and free agency without perhaps knowing what those two may do?
Yeah, I think they're definitely in a little bit of a holding pattern, but there are things that they can address. Like they can work out the restricted deals with guys like Jeremy Swayman and Trent Frederick. I do think they would really love to keep Tyler Bertuzzi, who was one of those trade deadline acquisitions who fit in really well, tied for the team lead in scoring in the playoffs. They could probably start those conversations and also start throwing out feelers for, different guys that they might trade away to free up some of that money. So
yeah,
that all I think needs to happen no matter what. So they don't have to wait for Bergeron and Krejci on that. But yeah, depending on what they do, obviously that, will ultimately affect how they move forward this offseason.
For people that keep an eye on the Boston Bruins from afar, Scott McLaughlin, WEEI, he will keep you up to date this summer on what's going on with their offseason. Anything else we should keep an eye out for other than all the stuff you just mentioned? When the Bruins pop up this summer, what should we be looking for, I guess?
Well, I think it is players that they might trade away. Whether it is a goalie, I think they would be more likely to hang on to Swayman. So, I think there's a lot of teams that'd be interested in Linus Ullmark. 2 years left, $5 million a year. It's going to win the Vezina probably. So that would be a huge one. They have some defensemen, Matt Grzelcyk, Derek Forbort, that they'd probably look to move. And if they're going to keep Bertuzzi, possibly even a forward, you could see Taylor Hall or Jake DeBrusk pop up in trade rumors. So some big names there that they could, look to move on from, to both to free up cap space and to possibly recoup some draft picks, maybe get into the first or second round again.
It'll be interesting to see for teams like both the Bruins and the Penguins, I think, Scott, where teams clear up cap space this summer in another tight cap crunch offseason. Who are those teams out there that have some space that may feel like they're right on the brink of something? I think of Ottawa off the top of my head, or maybe Buffalo, and are willing to make a deal like that to help free up cap space for an aging team like the Bruins or Pens, and perhaps find a piece that puts them over the top. Thanks for doing this today. Really appreciate it. Enjoy the summer, and we'll keep an eye out for everything that's going on up in Boston. Appreciate it again. Scott McLaughlin, WEEI. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great stuff from Scott McLaughlin up at WEEI in Boston. We keep it in the Odyssey family as our friend Shaun Morash of CBS Sports Radio joins me now. Mraz, ultimately, your Rangers failed miserably. No, we're not going to do that this time. We're not going to go back and forth like we do on 5 Star Weekend on BetQL. We're going to have a serious hockey discussion.
I'm ready.
We're going to keep it real. So what the hell happened, man? I really thought Shesterkin was the key, and that would be enough to carry them through a couple of rounds. To leave early in the first round into this Devils team that is now getting absolutely handled by Carolina in the second round. What went wrong?
Well, there's a simple answer and there's a complex answer. The simple answer is the Devils made a goaltending switch after game 2 to Akira Schmid, and he got extremely hot, and the Rangers looked borderline unprepared for, what they were doing. He gave off rebounds. The Rangers weren't throwing off enough shots. They love to pass first. That's what happens when you add a Patrick Kane. You still have Panarin. And I just think the type of goaltending that Schmid brought to the table was not the type of offense the Rangers like to play, as they maybe overthink things and go for that extra pass way too often. But hot goaltending did him in, but it's tough to swallow that when you see how much the Devils' goaltending situation went in flux here in round 2 versus Carolina.
Yeah, what struck me, you mentioned Patrick Kane in there. Was he even on this team? He was missing down the stretch, especially, but then in the playoffs, this was supposed to be the key piece.
Yeah, and he had the big goal. I guess it was in game 2 when he went end to end. It was unbelievable. But after that, really nothing. At least Vladimir Tarasenko brought them a big punch. But the real problem is every time the Rangers had a power play after those first 2 games, they struggled mightily. And that top unit continued to feature Patrick Kane and Artemi Panarin on it, both of whom are pass-first type players more than shoot-first type players. And the Rangers, when they were cooking last year, eliminating the Penguins, eliminating the Hurricanes, it was Mika Zibanejad from the corner. It was Chris Kreider in the center. And, maybe you only had Fox or Panarin passing the puck. Now you had 3 passers out there in that first first unit. Tarasenko went to the second unit. That was brutal for them. They're limiting the power play time of guys like Filipino and Alexei Lafreniere and kind of holding the young guys back. And I think basically the Rangers, in what seemed like the perfect addition, just be as top heavy as possible, might have added too many cooks to the kitchen, and it totally disrupted where their strength already lied, which was that first power play unit.
So what happens then? Tarasenko, Kane, just off to free agency, and they use that cap. It's not a ton of cap space that frees up, actually. That's like $6 million, I want to say, between the two of them. So look, they've built a strong core, and they can go forward with that core. And again, they have the goaltending. So I would imagine, is it just little tweaks they need this offseason personnel-wise?
I think this is what's crazy, right? Because the Rangers now have fired Gerard Gallant, which I think is a mistake. But okay, now we'll hold and wait and see who the head coach is. The truth is, roster-wise, there will be tweaks. There might be a surprising trade, but a lot of these guys they've locked up long-term. Kreider, Panarin, Trocheck, they all have no move clauses. So they're not going to go anywhere. I'm very fearful that before they have to pay a Ryan Lindgren, who's an important defenseman for them, big money, that they would move somebody like that. Could they move a Keandre Miller, a defenseman, something like that? Maybe. But ultimately, you got to remember, before Tarasenko and Kane arrived, this was the team that was good enough to make the Eastern Conference Final a year ago, and everybody thought they were a year too early. Now you're pretty much going to bring that same core from 2 years ago back, but adding Vincent Trocheck, which they did a year ago. So I think you just need to calm the waters, take a deep breath, and see if the coach changes anything and gets more out of the young guys like Kakko, Lafreniere, and Hedl to take the next step. Although it's worth noting, they have more guys coming down the pipe. Brandon Othman is a guy who they think is going to be a big-time winger for them on the top six. Let's see if he's ready to go by next season, and that could be kind of the influx of that next scorer they need.
Okay, so if the personnel has been built out correctly, which we're led to believe, even if the deadline moves didn't quite work the way Drury wanted them to work, and it's just up to the head coaching position. Look, I don't like Gerard Gallant and the way he coaches and the way he tries to work the officiating in a series,
right.
But
the tough bully act, right?
Yeah, I mean, we know that's personal now between the Penguins and the Rangers, but I'll remove myself from that for just a moment and say, I think he was the right guy for this team. I think he's the fall guy. And so what are they looking for then in a head coach?
Well, I think if you were to knock Gallant on one thing and one thing in particular, it would be being almost too hard on the young guys. I mean, they have the kid line is the line that obviously generated a lot of offense for them last year. And I keep mentioning the Hedl, Kakko, and Lafreniere. A lot of their future and foundation is built on those guys. They just lined up Hedl long-term. They feel as if they're not getting quite the returns. I mean, Kakko was a number 2 overall pick, Lafreniere, number 1 overall pick. By next year, which will be year number 4 for Kakko, year number 3 for Lafreniere, at some point, these guys got to start becoming 30 goal scorers because that's the type of, hype they had coming in. So I think the thought was Gallant might have been holding them back a little bit, leaning on his veterans too much. Those guys were playing an average of 5 to 6 minutes less of ice time per game than some of those big lines. They need more power play time, and maybe they just need a different type of not as strong-willed head coach on them, but the Rangers really have a lot lying on those guys taking the next step in their careers.
All right, then tell me why Larry Brooks, the New York Post, is making up rumors about some weird thing where Kyle Dubas comes to Pittsburgh to be the Penguins GM, brings his head coach with him, and Mike Sullivan, for some reason, gets sent packing to the Rangers. Why is he making things up like this?
I'm not going to say he's making them up or not making them up. I will just say this. Mike Sullivan has ties to the Ranger organization. He came from the Rangers. He has, from what I understand, a relationship with guys behind the scenes, including Dolan. This could be a way for the Rangers to say, look, we've had head coaches to get us to cups. Vigneault, who I'd bring back. Gallant got his teams to cups. You need a guy who could put that finishing touch on, and Mike Sullivan might be that. Do I think he's the favorite? No, I don't. Do I think the Rangers might go into their minor league system for a head coach? Yeah, maybe. I'm very worried that they're going to botch this, though, Mac. I think this could be what sets the Rangers back here, that they fired Gallant without a true plan.
Man, maybe if they had like somebody in a really strong leadership position, like a real stand-up guy wearing the C on their jersey.
Well, they do have that. His name is Jacob Trouba. But all kidding aside, Mac, this is the first I'm going to tell you. Trouba was Gallant's boy. Like, that is why he was named captain of that room. And the Rangers took so long naming a captain. I wonder if he's not the captain anymore if they bring a new head coach in there.
I think that's it. Like we go back and forth with each other and we bust each other's chops all the time about Trouba because of him and Crosby last year in the playoffs and just Trouba's track record in general. But I think that's for Rangers fans and for Penguins fans who are trying to get an eye on what the Rangers may do this offseason. I think that actually is a very valid point. Is there a shakeup of some sort in the leadership structure? Yeah. And how does that affect the room with a bunch of young guys that really are at the core?
And one more quick one for you. Their assistant captain, Barclay Goudreau's won a couple cups with the Lightning. He's making a lot of money to play on a fourth line now. That's another guy, you don't know, might be stripped of an A or shipped out of here to begin with for salary.
So what do we look for? Not just draft weekend when deals always get made. The Rangers only have 4 picks in the draft. I want to say 2 of them are late. And then July 1st come free agency. Are they involved?
Mac, I think they're going to be very quiet in free agency. I really, really do believe that. I think they're going to hope that, as I mentioned, that kid Hoffman takes the next step. And I think they're thinking that their free agents are going to come from within. The head coach is going to get the most out of Hedl, Kakko, and Lafreniere. Maybe a minor piece to add to like a third line because they're going to have to replace Tarasenko and Kane. But overall, I think this will be a very quiet Ranger offseason outside of the head coaching search. Maybe a surprise trade, maybe. But I wouldn't bank on it because it takes 2 to tango.
Okay. Good stuff, as always, Morash. Thank you. Shaun Morash from the DA Show on CBS Sports Radio. One Giant Step, the New York Football Giants podcast. What else? Oh, BetQL's 5-star weekend. We do that thing.
Pretty important show, Mac.
Yeah, Sunday morning. I'll be there. Thanks again, Morash.
Later, buddy.
All right, see you. Great stuff, as always, from Shaun Morash on the Rangers. Let's go to the Western Conference now as we take a spin around here on Fifth Avenue Faceoff to all of the cities, all of the markets that were eliminated in the first round. I'll be honest, I had them going farther than, the first round. The Minnesota Wild eliminated in the first round by the Dallas Stars. Jessi Pierce covers them for NHL.com. Jessi, thanks for the time today. How are you?
Hey, I'm good. How are you? I'm trying to enjoy the offseason again because the Minnesota Wild have made this a theme, it seems, after the first round.
Then we can hug it out over that because the Penguins 5 straight years now have lost early, have been bounced from the playoffs. And so the commonality here, too, is that Billy Guerin is the GM there now in Minnesota. There are important pieces in place in Minnesota that were once Penguins products, I think, in particular in goal, and Marc-Andre Fleury and Philip Gustafsson. So I guess the first question, though, is, look, everyone knew that Dallas was this suffocating defensive team who might be able to choke the life out of whoever they played in the first round. But it didn't really go down that way. So what worked for the Wild in that series against the Stars? What didn't work? And why are they playing golf right now?
They are playing golf because they can't kill a penalty to save their lives. That was absolutely detrimental. I mean, they struggled on special teams in general, but the Minnesota Wild entered the playoffs without Joel Eriksson, one of their key face-off guys, one of their key penalty killers and top power play unit guys. So that obviously hurt them. However, I think the series against Dallas was winnable. Now, that's not to discredit Dallas. Obviously, Jake Ottinger and net was huge for them. But really, I think Minnesota, when they played their game, played them very well. And when they played 5-on-5 hockey, they played very well, almost better. Again, they were facing a Dallas Star squad without Joe Pavelski as well, who was injured in that first game, courtesy of Matt Dumba. But really, that's what it was. Special teams, I think, was awful. And then it seems like Minnesota just kind of gave up. I know they obviously did not, but it seemed certainly, their losses in 5 and 6 were different than their loss in game 4. I think their losses in 5 and 6, they just seem to not mentally be there. Again, that's my perception, but I think that's what really hurt them in the end. Dallas seemed to want it maybe just a little bit more.
If you had to theorize, what's driving that? I mean, what is the leadership structure like there? And is it strong enough to push guys when they're in that uncomfortable position, I guess, of losing and then all of a sudden you lose the series lead, and then all of a sudden you're on the road and you're in a tough environment, and bang, now the other team's got control of the series, and it all happens in a course of 4 or 5 days. Who is it in the room that should be the one? I would imagine like a Marcus Foligno maybe, or a Matt Zuccarello, but are they the guys that are kind of steering that room?
I mean, they generally are. Jared Spurgeon's obviously wearing the C, but he's less vocal. Marcus Foligno, the big loud voice in there as an alternate, and Matt Dumba, another big voice as an alternate. But yeah, Zuccarello, Marc-Andre Fleury. I mean, there's a good mix of veteran presence with the youthfulness that Minnesota has that there should have been a little bit more. I also think Dean Evson could have stepped in just a smidge more. I think, again, for the 3rd straight year, Minnesota was outcoached a little bit. Dean didn't tweak maybe some of the lines enough as he should. But ultimately, when it comes to that mentality that I spoke of. Ryan Reeves, I think, summed it up best in our exit interviews with the players once the season wrapped. He had said, maybe we let the officials get into our heads. Maybe we let those penalties really get to us. I know there was a lot of calls and cries for unfair officiating, which I think went both ways. But you look at a 5-minute major and game misconduct against Marcus Foligno in that game 5, that turned the tides. And I think mentally they just kind of defeated themselves a little bit in that essence. And it could have been as a result of not feeling confident on their penalty kill and then taking some pretty bad penalties as well.
So how hot is Dean Evason's seat going into next year?
You know what? We asked Bill Guerin, and Bill Guerin shoots us straight, but not straight enough sometimes. I think he's safe only because currently Minnesota is very salary cap strapped. Now, that doesn't necessarily apply to Dean Evason, but he still has 2 years on the contract. And I imagine owner Craig Leopold does not want to pay more people that are no longer with the organization. I think the assistants are probably getting a hard look at. Bob Woods has been around for quite some time, Brett McLean and Darby Hendrickson as well. Again, those guys deal with the special teams. Those guys deal with faceoffs, areas that they struggled. But things have to change. I think Dean moving forward needs to be willing to not be married to his lines. We saw that time and time again the past 2 seasons in particular. Like, yes, when things are working, you want to keep it. But again, Dean did not respond to Pete DeBoer last year. He didn't respond to Craig Berube and the St. Louis Blues when they were in. So I think Dean's definitely going to have to look at this year differently than maybe he has in years past.
So when we look up around the weekend of the draft, what are they going to be up to, knowing that you're staring down the barrel of Dumba and Klingberg both going to free agency? I would imagine some middle of the road depth pieces like Nyquist and Sundqvist, both unrestricted free agents as well. What's their plan? They've got picks to deal with, and that they've got 3 in the top 2 rounds if they wanted to do something there. Or is it more of a sit around and wait for free agency play for Billy Guerin?
Part of me feels like it might be a sit around and wait for free agency. You had mentioned the defensive pieces that will be moving on. Unfortunately, Minnesota will not likely be able to keep Matt Dumba at the salary hit that he's at. So he will probably walk and test free agency for the first time. But luckily, the prospect pool for Minnesota is deep, and that goes from offense to defense. But in particular with defense, you saw Brock Faber jump right into the playoffs after a devastating University of Minnesota loss in the national championship. I say that because I'm a Gopher fan as well, and that killed me. I know. It was brutal. But I think he played incredibly well, all things considered. He fit in very seamlessly. He, among some other guys that are down in the American Hockey League, Bill Guerin is going to have to rely on those ELCs, on those cheap guys, unless he's going to package some picks and some players to go out, because again, he is paying out of pocket for quite a few players. You mentioned Gus Nyquist. He's gone. Would love to try to bring him back. There's just no money. So I imagine free agencies where he might make a bigger splash, but who knows, if something comes across his way during the draft too, might be active.
Do you think he tries to juggle goalies again next year as well? I mean, I would think that's the play, but I mean, because I don't know if Flower can play a full season anymore.
Right. I mean, and we saw that this year. I think that was the plan heading into the season, was Flower was going to get the lion's share. Philip Gustafson, an untested goalie. Nobody really knew that he had this within him. He wasn't given that opportunity in Ottawa, had never been given this opportunity in his career. And he did great. I mean, he was one of the best netminders down the stretch of the regular season, and he played fantastic in the playoffs. So I think it'll be a rotation of sorts, if not Philip Gustafson getting the bigger load of starts. And I think Marc-Andre Fleury, Pittsburgh fans know this. He's a fantastic human. He doesn't care. He just wants to help win. And he was so good for Gus in between the pipes. I'm excited to see. I think Philip Gustafson needs to get in better conditioning shape. I think that's the biggest thing he needs to work on. But ultimately, it'll be some sort of rotation with probably like a 70-30, maybe even for Gus to Fleury.
I mean, if the Wild would like to be so generous as to donate one of those goaltenders back to Pittsburgh, it's worth a thought. I thought maybe just if there are 2 things Penguin fans would like to have back in retrospect, and look, they both made sense at the time. It's the Derek Brassard trade, where Philip Gustafson was sent to Ottawa, and it's the Murray Fleury decision, which made all the sense in the world at the time. But now in retrospect, you just go, oh no. So I guess, we We appreciate you entertaining the thought for all of about 1.2
I
seconds.
just like him in the locker room. He's my favorite person to talk to. So that's really just selfishly. He's just the best person I've ever spoken with.
He's a fantastic human. Tell him everybody in Pittsburgh said hello and misses him and loves him. And thanks again, Jessi. I appreciate you dialing us in on the Wild just a little bit as we get ready to enjoy the summer. Thanks again.
Always appreciate it.
Great stuff from Jessi Pierce, NHL.com. She covers the Wild. We will keep it out west. She talked a little smack earlier before we started recording on Colorado, saying nobody cares about the Avs. Evan Rawal, who covers the Colorado Avalanche, he joined us earlier in the season, was so great. We had to have him back from Colorado Hockey Now. Evan, how are you?
I'm doing good. How are you?
We're okay. We're all in the same boat right now. Although, while the Penguins didn't make it to the playoffs, the Avs made it, and everybody, I think, expected that we were kind of bound for, at least I thought we were bound for a Western Conference Finals repeat engagement between the Avs and the Oilers. We didn't get it. We get the Bruins bounced in the first round. We get the Avs bounced in the first round. Upsets all over the place. And the first question we have to ask is, what the heck went wrong?
No depth. The Avs just do not have the depth that they had last year, and it became more and more apparent. And once Valeri Nichushkin left the series with, his personal issues where there's still just a lot of mystery around what's going on there.
Right.
It really became apparent that the Avs just did not have the depth to keep up with Seattle, who, we've already seen in the second round, the depth is what they have. Everyone on the team can play, and it was a big issue for the Avalanche throughout the playoffs, and they did not get a single goal from a bottom six forward in the playoffs, which is just remarkable. And when you consider it was a 1-goal game in this game 7, that kind of makes a big difference. So that was the difference for the Avs.
Does anybody look at it as sort of it's hard to say removing one person from the lineup, and you just mentioned Nichushkin as well, so 2 people from the lineup maybe, and people I think forget about Gabe Landeskog. You can't forget about him, but he wasn't there for so long that I think people forgot about the fact that he was missing, and there is a huge trickle down effect, I would think, to then guys being elevated. We've seen it here in Pittsburgh over the years where when they don't have the depth, Malkin or Crosby is out, or another top 6 forward. They don't always have. They have guys that are ready, willing to step up, but not necessarily always able. Did that trickle down effect when you took the Landeskog absence? When you pile Nichushkin on top of that, is that what led to that depth being exposed?
Absolutely. Landeskog was gone all year, so it was something that they had kind of had to play around with all year. But Nichushkin, it was a bridge too far for the team. Once he left, they had already, were missing guys, and they have basically been injured the whole year. But, so seeing guys just leave in the playoffs was not a huge surprise. But they didn't go out and really get any forward help at the deadline. They got Lars Eller, who's, he's past his prime. He's a defensive center at this point. He's not a big goal scorer. So once Nichushkin was down, they didn't really have anyone to fit in. Matt Nieto was who moved in the top 6, and Matt Nieto is, he scored, I think, 1 goal in the last 26 games. So that's kind of how bad things were for the Avs. But it really was a trickle down effect. And, Landeskog's absence was really felt in the playoffs. And obviously Nichushkin as well.
Well, they've got an opportunity here going into the offseason to kind of remake all of that depth, though, right? With, I want to say, everybody on the bottom 2 lines, if not then some, is an unrestricted free agent, a couple restricted free agents in there as well, like Alex Newhook. They've got an opportunity. And look, the blue line is strong. I don't know. Maybe you saw it differently in the series against Seattle, but I don't necessarily lay the issues at the feet of anybody on defense. But I think they're lucky in regards that they've built that out fairly nicely and can move forward with the blue line that they have for the most part. They've got an opportunity to remake the bottom 6, or maybe even the middle 6, if you want to look at it that way. What do you think their game plan is going into this offseason?
Well, the Landeskog news gives them a little bit of clarity in that they can kind of use that cap space next season. But they're going to have to remake the bottom 6. You got Darren Helm, who's likely going to retire. Andrew Cogliano, he could keep playing, but he's 36. He's played 1,200 games. He might call it a career too. And Matt Nieto is going to be an unrestricted free agent, so I don't know if any of those guys will really come back. So they're going to have some room to play with. They don't have a ton of young guys ready to come up and step up in the NHL, so they're going to have to find some guys. But defense is in good shape. The one thing that they might do is, they have Bowen Byram was up for a new contract.
Mm-hmm.
Devon Taves is 1 year from unrestricted free agency, and Sam Girard's got 4 years. So I could see one of those guys getting moved. This could be the year where one of those guys get moved. Probably not Byram, but one of those guys gets moved for some forward help, because they have a lot of high-end defensive guys signed moving forward. So it's just a matter of kind of spreading things out throughout the lineup. But that's something I could see happen.
Let's workshop some things here. You're singing some sweet music to my ears, maybe, as far as getting a top pairing compliment to Chris Letang in his last couple of years with the Penguins, Devon Taves. What's Colorado looking for in that kind of deal? Is it, I think about a team that's got so much in place. They're not necessarily building for the future. I don't think they're looking for draft picks, which works because the Penguins don't have any to deal, really. Is it you mentioned forward depth, but the Penguins are a team that's in a similar boat, and that their depth, their bottom six is just a disaster. So what do you think? I'll put you in Chris McFarland's shoes. What's he looking for?
It's got to be a top six forward who's got some term on it. So
okay,
the Avs, I don't think they want to trade Devon Taves, and they might not trade him. It's just a matter of, can they get him to agree to a long-term extension that kind of fits within the team? Because after Devon Taves, they have to deal with Mikko Rantanen's next contract. So it just kind of keeps building on each other. So I don't think they want to trade Devon Taves. Sam Girard is another guy who signed for 4 more years at $5 million. That's a guy that could have a lot of value on the trade market, just because he's a top 4 defenseman and he's young and he's signed for a while. But for Taves or for any of those guys, I don't think they're moving them for anything more than a top 6 forward who signed for a while.
Well, Brian Rust is signed for a long time. I'm just saying, Evan, if there's any interest, we'll talk to people and see if we can intermediate something here.
I don't think that's going to be.
Damn it. I thought I had you for a second.
Yeah.
The line was out there in the water, and I felt something, and then it came up, and it was a boot attached to the fishhook. It was worth a shot anyway. The goaltending situation, what's it look like going forward?
For the first time in a few years, they're set and net going into the offseason. Alexander Georgiev he's kind of a revelation. I think there was a lot of questions heading into the season about whether or not he could be a starting goaltender, and I think he played twice as many games as he's ever played in a regular season, and he was great all year. He had some dips, but that's what any goalie does. Really, the only issue is Pavel Francouz, the backup. He's a good backup. He just couldn't stay healthy during the year, and he's already had off-season surgery. Mm-hmm. So it's if he's healthy, they're set in net. They don't have anything to worry about there, which is nice.
So when it comes around to draft time, I mentioned the Avs, they don't have a ton of picks either. I don't think they have anything between the first round and the 5th round, I want to say it is. Mm-hmm. And again, not necessarily a team that's building for the future. They're building for now. So when we get to draft weekend, and then shortly after that, we get to free agency at the beginning of July. What do we keep an eye out for with the Avs? How do they remake that bottom 6? Do they look to maybe sign top 6 talent? You talked about possibly bringing some in a trade and push that depth down a little bit on the forward units. What should we keep an eye out for? What will be the first thing they should jump on?
That first round pick, they held on to it at the deadline. I'm not so sure they're going to hold on to it this summer. I think with the Landeskog news, they have cap space. I think they're going to try to get creative, and they don't have a ton of trade assets. That's one they have. I think it's going to be on the market if they can find a top 6 forward that fits. Free agency, not a lot of great free agents out there, in my opinion, just looking at the list. If Jonathan Taves wants to continue his career, the Avs were linked to him, kind of following him all year long. Okay. I could see him being a guy that they try to fit in, probably more like a third-line center at this point in his career. If they can find a second-line center, I think he's a guy who fits. I think Evan Rodriguez is a guy they're going to want to try to bring back, but it's got to be at the right price. JT Compher's an unrestricted free agent, but he had the type of year where you look at him and say, some team's going to really overpay him based on what he's done in his career, just based off of this 1 year that he had. So I think they're going to look at some forwards. They don't really need to look at defense other than depth, but there's just not a lot of forwards out there in the free agent market. So I think they're going to have to get creative in the trade market.
Evan Rodriguez, the streakiest player alive. He's fantastic for a couple weeks at a time and then disappears for months.
Yeah, he was very up and down, which is why it's got to be at the right price. But he sounded like a guy who really wants to stay in Colorado after the year. So
Yeah, it fit for him. It was a perfect fit, and with his ability to move up and down the lineup, especially. All right, you're great at sharing the podcast on social media when you come on with us, and I know a ton of Avs fans listened last time you were on. So I want to say something to Avs fans right now. I love you dearly, and I really like Nathan MacKinnon. Seems like a great guy. But no, you cannot have Sidney Crosby for the last few years of his career. Enough with that nonsense. Enough with that rumor. I'm telling you, stop. It's not happening. No, we're building statues of Sidney Crosby that we can just drag out to center ice on the day he retires. So it's not happening. I'm sorry. I had to get that off my chest, Evan.
I have a feeling that's not going to stop him. I get sent those photoshopped pictures of Crosby in an Avs jersey every day. So I don't think that's stopping anyone.
Keep hope alive, I guess. Keep dreaming, kids. We appreciate the time today, Evan. Thanks again, as always.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Great stuff, as always, from Evan Rawal of Colorado Hockey Now. Thanks to him for joining. I feel like we're going down a list of teams that we are surprised are out already. We talked Bruins, we talked Rangers, we talked Avs, and now we talk Lightning. Maybe for anybody up in Ontario, they're not surprised that the Lightning are out. They really had some kind of belief in the Maple Leafs. I don't know. Maybe the people in Ontario are actually the ones who are most surprised that the Leafs made it through to the second round and the Lightning did not. Erik Erlendsson of LightningInsider.com joins me now to talk about the Bolts' first round exit and their season as a whole. Thanks for the time, Erik. How are you?
I'm good. Trying to get used to the short playoff run for the Lightning. It's been a while.
Yeah. When's the last time you've had the back half of May available to you? It's
2019.
Yeah. I mean, it's been a while. So here we are with the Lightning. This is a question I asked of Scott McLaughlin of WEEI in Boston about the Bruins, because they're staring down retirements in their case, right? And Bergeron and Krejci. But I'll ask the question about the Lightning. Are they aging out? I know they've done a great job of cultivating talent as they've been winning over the years, but are they starting to come up against some age issues?
No, they're not aging out. They are salary capping out is the problem. I mean, you look at we just had lunch with a couple of other media members the other day, and you could put together quite a list of players who were part of the team's 2 Stanley Cup championships and put together quite a team of those players who have left. I mean, we're talking Blake Coleman and Barclay Goodrow and Ryan McDonough. And I mean, just go down the list. This year, we're probably going to have to add Alex Killorn to that list. I don't see any way that the Lightning are going to be able to bring Alex Killorn back. And that's what it comes down to. Are Victor Hedman and Steven Stamkos getting older? Yeah, father age will always catch up to every single one of us. We can't escape him. And it's even worse for pro athletes. But I mean, Steven Stamkos still had a 30-goal campaign at the age of 32. He'll turn 34 next February. So he's not at the end of his career. He's trending that way, but he's not there yet. Victor Hedman had an off year. There's no doubt about it. But I think he's a guy that can come back and be the effective player that he is. And Nikita Kucherov is 30. Andrei Vasilevsky is 30. Braden Point is 26. Anthony Cirelli is 25. Mikhail Sergachev is 25. I mean, you go down the list of the players who are still in their mid to late 20s that are still part of the core of this team. So it's not age that's catching up with this team. Maybe some fatigue because of the amount of games. I mean, in particular, Andrei Vasilevsky, he's played 71 playoff games since 2020. I mean, that's more than he plays in a regular season. So it's more than a season's worth of extra games. Plus you add in all the extra overtime minutes and everything else. He was at 4,000 minutes. So with this team, it's not age, it's cap and chipping away at the depth that they've been able to acquire and utilize to their strength, which, this is really the first year you kind of saw the difference the lack of depth made.
So how does Julien Brisebois manage that this offseason, knowing that he can't go nuts on the free agent market because he's got a bunch of big numbers on the cap? He doesn't necessarily have the resources built around the draft. I think he's got three picks maybe at the very end of the draft. So he doesn't have those to trade. Is he creative enough to sort of continue to replenish this roster on the fly?
Yeah, I think you've already seen him do some of that, actually. And you just go back to the Brandon Hagel and Nick Paul trades at the deadline last year, right? Nick Paul was signed to a 7-year deal. Brandon Hagel still under contract for 1 year. And he was he comes off the best offensive season of his career. He was a great fit with Nikita Kucherov and Braden Point for a good part of the regular season. Odds are they'll get him tied up to a long-term deal. The deal to bring in Tanner Jeannot. I know it was a lot to give up, and he didn't perform, and Julien BriseBois is catching a lot of heat for that trade. But Tanner Jeannot was not brought in for this year. He's an RFA. The expectation is he will sign a longer-term contract to keep him around and get him comfortable with the system. Mikey Eyssimont, it's the same situation, right? They bring him in from San Jose, a guy in his mid-20s who's just kind of on that cusp of maybe finding out who he is. They sign him to a 2-year deal that's very team-friendly. And, and they're going to have to hope that some of their prospects, they don't have grade A prospects because of the number of picks they have traded away through the years, but they do have some guys that they feel can come up and contribute. So that's how they're going to have to do this. They don't have a lot of money. Actually, as bad as the cap situation's been for the Lightning the last couple of years, this is probably the worst year, depending on whether the cap's only going to go up $1 million. There is some talk that maybe the PA will push for it to go up a little bit more, maybe, inject that inflator clause that they have in there to kind of open up some more space. But it's going to be difficult. There's no depth. There's no doubt the depth is going to be, chipped away a little bit more again this year. I think you have to look at a guy like Ross Colton, who is a restricted free agent with arbitration rights. Maybe he's the guy you have to trade to get back some draft picks, because you probably can't afford him. So there's a lot of affordability at work here for Julien BriseBois. He definitely has his hands tied and his work cut out for him.
So when he's looking at, for example, you mentioned Killorn, that's probably a no-go just because of what the market rate is going to be for an Alex Killorn. Are there other unrestricted free agents? You mentioned a couple restricted free agents. Are there other targets that he can retain that he has an eye on? Or when you look at the Lightning's roster, it doesn't seem like it's really primed for a bunch of turnover. So if that's the case, can they bring back, in essence, much of the same team minus Killorn and a couple other smaller pieces and say, hey, we believe we're still good enough to make runs. We were just tired. We just hit a wall or whatever it may have been in that series against Toronto.
They feel that way. There's no doubt, especially when it comes to Andrei Vasilevskiy, who admitted after the season was over that maybe he didn't handle himself. He had dealt with some new issues that he'd never dealt with in his career in terms of mental fatigue and some nagging injuries that he tried to push through. So he's always going to be the key. As long as he comes back and can be the Vezina style caliber goalie that he has been the previous 5 years of his career, then they'll always have a chance. So they feel that way. As far as the UFAs, I'm not expecting Corey Perry back, not expecting Pierre-Edouard Bellemare to return. Interesting to see what they're going to do with Ian Cole, with Hedman and Sergachev on the left side. They've got Hayden Fleury under contract, but is Hayden Fleury a guy that you're going to count on to take on some of the minutes and roles that Ian Cole picked up, who picked him up for Ryan McDonough? Right. Those are some important minutes that they're going to ask that left side D to play. So like the bottom lines, the bottom six will look different. There's no doubt. Eyssimont coming back really helps, but with no Bellemare and no Perry, most likely, that's the area that they're probably going to have the newest faces. But it will be interesting to see what they do, because the defensive depth, I feel better about their depth right now than I did maybe towards the end of the season because of the way that Darren Radish performed at the end of the year, as well as Nick Perbix. But they still have questions on their depth on defense. And that's the one area, if they're going to target something in free agency, that's probably where it will come, and it'll probably become on the left side.
The one thing we always come back to with Tampa, the one consistency, aside from some of the big names, you mentioned Vasilevskiy, Stamkos, Hedman at the top of the list, is John Cooper. And in the NHL, we know what the environment is. The easiest thing to change sometimes, just ask Gerard Gallant, is the head coach, even if he's not the primary problem. We're similar, though, here in Pittsburgh in that Mike Sullivan has been here, 2 Stanley Cups. A lot of people say, well, fine, get us another one now or get us close to one. In John Cooper's case, the track record is much more recent. So I don't want to say, is John Cooper on the hot seat, or how much longer should John Cooper have to trade off the cup rings that he's brought to Tampa? Because I think, A, he's a very good coach, and B, he does deserve a lot of leeway. But what is his, I guess, what is his position within this organization, in so much as is he here until he doesn't want to be anymore?
You get the sense that that's what the case is. And if you look at the way that the team performed, like I was one who I anticipated this was the year Toronto was going to get past Tampa Bay in the first round and finally break that curse. I didn't think it was going to happen the way it did. The Lightning thoroughly outplayed the Leafs most of that series. The Leafs got 6 goals off of deflections. You know, they got the breaks that you sometimes need to have in a playoff situation, right? So if you look at the way that the team actually performed in the series against the Leafs, the Lightning were the better team. And that to me is coaching, right? They put together a game plan to devise a way. I mean, Cooper even said it during the series. We know how to have success against these guys. And they did. They just didn't score. They didn't score enough. They let in too many goals. There's no doubt that's where it always starts. But Austin Matthews scored 5 goals. Braden Point didn't have a goal after game 1. Nikita Kucherov didn't have a goal after game 1. That's ultimately where the series was decided, was Tampa's big guys didn't show up, which is unusual. So when you kind of encapsulate all that, I think John Cooper is still the right guy for this team. He just has a masterful way of relating to his players. And the fact that in the NHL, and we know how it works, the shelf life for a coach in the NHL is usually short. And usually the players start to tune out the message. The message is not being tuned out. And as long as that remains the case, and as long as the team continues to have success, then John Cooper will remain the head coach here.
So when we get to the end of June in Nashville at the draft, and we push through to free agency starting a couple days after that, what's the first thing we should keep an eye out for from the Lightning and what they may do this offseason?
Well, it might actually happen before. Like I mentioned, Ross Colton is a guy to keep an eye on. If the Lightning don't have a pick until the 5th round, I think. So they're going to sit pretty bored at the table there at Bridgestone Arena for a few hours on day 2 before they even get a chance to go to the microphone. So if you're going to recoup some draft picks, that's probably a guy to look at. If after that, it's probably going to be a quiet. The only thing you wonder, they do need a backup goalie. I don't expect Brian Elliott to be returning anytime soon. So that's the one area that they're going to be busy. If they just signed Matt Tompkins, who I think was Canada's goaltender at the Olympics last year. Is he a depth guy, or is he a guy that you're looking at to back up Vasilevsky? I don't know the answer to that right now. So that's the one area I look at. Otherwise, I don't expect them to be busy with the unrestricted free agent market. The thing to keep an eye on is their own guys, right? It's, Brandon Hagel, I mentioned him. He's scheduled to be an RFA after next season. And the bigger one to keep an eye on is Steven Stamkos. He's entering the last year of his contract. He's eligible to sign on July 1st. So that's the one thing with this team. Just like last year when they came out of the gate and re-signed Cirelli, Chernak, and Mikhail Sergachev to extensions, will actually be trying to keep their own guys. So if they're going to be busy, that's the one area you're probably going to have to look at.
Is that Breezeball blowing you up there on the phone, trying to find out what's going on in Pittsburgh?
No, it wasn't.
You're supposed to lie, Erik. You're supposed to lie right through your teeth. Yes, we have a very important call coming up. No, I appreciate the time as always. It's great to catch up with you. We'll look forward to doing it again next season. But thanks for the time and breaking down what happened with the Lightning, not just in the first round, but throughout the year, and what to keep an eye out for with them this summer. Erik Erlendsson, Lightning Insider. Thanks again for the time.
All right, thanks, Chris. I appreciate it. Be well.
Yep. Thanks, man. Great stuff from Erik Erlendsson, who covers the Lightning, Tampa Bay Lightning for lightninginsider.com. Great to catch up with him. From the tropics to, another island of sorts. Stefen Rosner of the Hockey News. He covers the Islanders, and he's, Long Island. That's where they play. Stefen, thanks for making the time today. How are you?
No problem. How are you?
Great. And interested to hear what happened to this Islanders team that, I'll be honest, I thought was because of the way they play. I always look at them and say, regardless of whether they're hot going into the playoffs or not, the last 4 or 5 years, I've always looked at them and said, I do not want to face them in the playoffs because they play prototypical playoff hockey. But it didn't work this year. What failed them in the first round?
Yeah, I think first off, special teams, right? They ended the regular season with the 3rd worst power play in hockey. I think it was around 15.8%. And you look at the teams that make it, when you get to the playoffs, special teams is huge. And the Islanders 5-on-5 against Carolina, they dominated. For most of that series, they dominated. It was just special teams went 1 for 18 on the power play. They allowed 5 power play goals for the Carolina Hurricanes. So, yeah, it's that's that's not going to get it done. And you had Sorokin. You thought, okay, if Sorokin came into the series,
Sure.
he would have to bail him out a bunch of times. And unfortunately, he didn't really do that early in the series. Game 2, you look at that game. Is it his fault of the bounces? No, but there's a few goals in that game that he's got to stop as the elite goaltender that he is, and it doesn't come through. Look at Game 6, that overtime winner that sneaks past Sorokin. You feel for him because he was elite that game.
Yeah.
Kept that game close. I mean, Islanders were dominated in the third period. They tried to sit back with a 1-goal lead. It didn't work. And then that goal goes in. So it was a combination of a lot of things. It was also that major issue with the Islanders where in every postseason run where they've come up short is they couldn't get that one extra goal.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, if they get a goal in the second period, do they win that game and force the Game 7? Probably. It just didn't happen.
Well, have they considered, when Lou Lamoriello takes a step back and looks at how this thing is constructed, is he going to consider that as, that's the one through line or thread or overarching piece to this when they've fallen short the last few years is what I said, hey, great playoff style team, but they can't punch through for that one extra goal. You still have to be able to score. You can't win everything 2-0. Is it going to change the way Lou Lamoriello manages this roster?
Well, we're trying to figure out if Lou's coming back. All the information has it is that his contract's up. He wouldn't talk about that the last time we spoke to him, which actually was in Tampa, April 1st. Someone asked him about it, and he goes, maybe you get your facts right, something like that about his contract.
He was not happy about that, yeah.
No, and you have to ask the question. We all agree that we think that was his last year, and we're figuring out right now that the long process of him not talking, because he hasn't addressed the media yet, neither is Lane, is they're trying to figure out what's next. If he's back, whoever is back, you look at they need another elite forward. They got Bo Horvat at the deadline. The offense wasn't really there during the regular season when he joined over. Barzal did get hurt. They only played 6 games together. And in the playoffs, he had 1 goal, which was a shorthanded goal in garbage time in a game. So he didn't live up to expectations. But Horvat's a goal scorer in this league, sure. But is he that elite sniper this Islanders team has been longing for? I don't think so. That guy, maybe Oliver Wahlstrom turns into that guy. The problem right now the Islanders have to deal with is they have UFAs. They have to figure out if they want them back. They don't have a ton of cap space. And if they want to sign a player like that or trade for a player with a high annual value, they got to move some contracts. A guy like Josh Bailey, who's at a $5 million cap hit, who was a healthy scratch often and did not play a single postseason game. You got to find a way to move on from those guys, whether it be including a draft pick or buying. You have to do something to alleviate your cap issues in order to make it even possible. I think getting a puck-moving defenseman might be a higher priority because that changes everything. A puck-moving defenseman might help get more offense as well as help the defensive zone as well. So, the Islanders have a lot of question marks they got to figure out.
Well, yeah, and I don't think people think of the Islanders roster in this way, but when you break it down, you're right. You end up looking at, I want to say 8 or 9 contracts at an average annual value of $5 million or more per year. And that starts in a flat cap world, or the cap only going up by $1 million or whatever it may be. That becomes very difficult to manage with the escalating salaries of the Horvats and Barzals that you mentioned also. So do they look to move some of those salaries out? And, I've talked about this with several people now. The Penguins may be looking to do something like that. In their case, it's non-productive salary. The Bruins may be looking to do something like that. They're up against the cap. Multiple teams are already talking about how do we move salary out in order to reshape things or give us the ability to reshape things. But we all end up coming back to the same issue we came to around trade deadline time, which was, well, who wants to take on salary in this brave new world? And there's only a couple teams you can think of here and there that may be young and feel like they're on the brink, the Senators, the Sabres, who are willing to take that salary on. And it seems like there's not many bedfellows to be made on the trade market in that regard.
And teams also know that those teams have to get rid of contracts.
Exactly.
So it's not like you could just dump a guy for free. I know like the Islanders did it with Andrew Ladd. They essentially gave him to the Islanders that can just take the money. But now teams are realizing, well, we might as well get something for it because we want to, win this trade as well. So I looked at, I did a story on Josh Bailey and the Blackhawks. Regardless of Bedard, obviously they're going to try to rebuild as quick as possible, but they're over $19 million away from the cap floor. So they could take on. I mean, they're gonna re-sign as many UFAs that they have in their RFAs, and they're not going to be like truly stressed with filling it. But a guy like Josh Bailey at $5 million to a team that has Taves and Kane are gone leadership wise.
Right.
Billy's played over 1,000 games. He's been a true professional through the healthy scratches. He's going to get to play there again. Bedard, could he learn something from Bailey? Of course he can. People that look at Josh Bailey and say he's got no value, he's regressed. The guy wears an A for a reason. Again, he's been around. He stayed in the NHL. To go into a room with the Bedards and the other young guys that this Blackhawks team have, I think there's beneficial stuff there. And again, cap-wise, it works. But like you said, there's not that many teams that can really do that. Arizona, at some point, Arizona's going to have to stop doing that because they got to find a way to build forward. Because right now they're doing all these things to what you're supposed to do to restart a rebuild, except they're not rebuilding. They just keep taking on. So yeah, I mean, you have Islander other deals. The problem is a lot of these contracts, like an Anders Lee, who struggled mightily in the playoffs. The Islanders aren't trading their captain. He's take a $7 million cap hit, but they're not going to move him. Matt Martin and Cal Clutterbuck, guys that have made up this fourth line for years, all spoke in their exit interviews about coming back and having a good season. And again, it depends who's in charge because Lou is loyal to a fault, but he's loyal. So would he be willing to move on from guys like that? Probably not. So it limits who you can get rid of. I think Pajot at $5 million a year with Horvat coming in. Horvat does everything Pajot does, plus provides more offense. And I'm not saying it's not important to have more than one guy that does a certain job, but I do believe that Horvat made Pajot a little bit expendable. You have Cizikas on the roster. You can move him to 3C or sign a cheaper 3C and move Pajot because teams that are trying to take that next step to win a Stanley Cup or whatever it is, Pajot is an NHL-ready guy that could help in the playoffs. So you have guys like that, Scott Mayfield, you could let him walk, then you got to fill that hole. So again, there's a lot of things the Islanders can do. The question is, depending on who's in charge, is that loyalty factor going to stop them from doing that?
Right. And if they do bring back a very similar roster, how does it get coached into a different position? And how much of this blew back on Lane Lambert after this first round exit?
Yeah, I definitely got out coached by Brind'Amour. I mean, it makes sense. Brind'Amour has the experience. Lane doesn't, despite being behind Barry Trotz for forever. But I looked at it more as his assistant coaches didn't do a good enough job this past year for him. I just wrote a column on that for the Hockey News, and I'll go into it a little bit. So he hires Doug Huda, who he played with in Detroit, defensive coach, penalty kill coach. He helped Moritz Seider develop. So you looked at him coming over, okay, can he help Noah Dobson take that next step? Can he help the young guys? Noah Dobson regressed. The defense as a whole, this was a defense under Barry Trotz that was one of the best defenses in hockey year after year. It was the reason why they not only made the playoffs, but went on those runs. If they didn't have that defensive structure, that's not happening. Adam Pelech, even though when he was healthy, looked a bit better, he regressed. Scott Mayfield struggled. There was a lot of guys that just, the defense didn't look the same, and you were hoping Huda would help with that. And again, Dobson was the biggest thing. You wanted to see him take steps forward defensively. We know he has the offensive talent, and he just regressed defensively. And you look at it as, okay, of course it's Lane's job to oversee everything, but you're bringing in a coach who specializes in a certain spot. They got to get that job done. That's how you keep your job. And you look at the power play coach, John McLean, who wasn't supposed to be hired. Brian Weissman was originally hired. Then something happened there. He doesn't get hired. Lou Lamoriello hires a buddy in Johnny McLean, and the Islanders' power play was atrocious to the point where they didn't make one change to the top power play unit until Game 6. They went the whole year struggling. They finally take Noah Dobson off. But all that time, you don't make a move again. That's on Lane you have to push that. But at the same time, Johnny Mac's being paid to run the power play. You got to do stuff. And I think you look at Lane, first year head coach, clearly he's going to be overwhelmed. He's going to make rookie mistakes. I think if he had more of maybe the assistant coaches did a better job to help him, the Islanders don't have to wait till game 82. Maybe they still finish in the top wildcard spot, but they're not waiting till game 82 to get it done. If the power play was 5% better, 3% better, it's a different ballgame. They could still be playing right now. So I think Lane has a lot to learn, but I don't think his assistant coaches helped out a lot. And if Lane is back, I can't see any way John McLean's back. Maybe Huda's back, but Johnny McLean, again, wasn't a Lane hire. That was a Lou hire. Lane could probably find someone that he wants to join the staff. But yeah, it's got to be a team effort for sure on the coaching front.
Good call. So when we get to late June and then a couple days later after the draft, and Isles don't have a first round pick, but things get done at the draft, and then free agency a couple days later. What are we keeping an eye out for? What's the move that we go, oh, okay, now we know what the Islanders are about this summer?
Well, first off, it's deciding what you're going to do with Bailey. Are you going to trade Bailey at the draft? Are you going to buy him out when the buyout window opens up? That's the first order of business because you got to make the clear-cut decision. If Bailey said that he wants to be back, he's got 1 year left at $5 million. But he said, I don't want to be back. I don't want to be watching if I'm back. Well, right now you look at the roster. He's going to be watching next year if he's back. So I think he's going to talk with Lou, whoever's in charge, and they're going to probably find a way to make it work. And I think if a new gem comes in that maybe likes Bailey, they might keep him. But you look at, it's funny. Barry Trotz always spoke so highly of Josh Bailey. Mm-hmm. Could he end up in Nashville? I don't know. There's things that got to be done. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but, talk is cheap. If you really like the guy, go go bring him in. But again, I talked about Chicago. They could buy him out, which saves them $2.3 million next year. But then it's, they have to pay him again over time. So that's 1.6 the year after. So again, that's a year, not this upcoming year, but after. Sorokin's a free agent. You're looking at him getting a max deal. You got to have as much money. I know the cap's going to go up, but you got to have the money. So I think the first order of business is starting to clear, because last summer in August, when we were waiting to hear about Kadri coming to the Islanders and stuff like that, and that was really close. And the sources told me that was very close to the point where Kadri's camp said to Lou, like, we want to sign with New York, is what I was told. And Lou said, okay, I just got to make the cap space. And come the end of August, that cap space was never created. You can't be in a cap strap in August.
Yeah.
Like the Islanders didn't make any moves at the deadline last year. You could have moved some contracts and put yourself in a better spot for free agency. And again, the Islanders only one acquisition this summer, and that was trading for Romanov, which seems like it's going to work out. But again, this is a team that had a lot of holes when there was talented players available. Not saying Kadri was the right guy. I don't think he would have been the right fit. But you have to figure out your cap situation well before August, because you have to improve this roster. If you run it back with this roster, again, it's not that the core is completely old. There's a lot of young talent on here. There's a lot of question marks. And again, the way they play, they tried to play Lambert hockey early in the year. The offense was good. I think it was over 3.5 goals per game for the first couple of months. The defense struggled. And then when it was time for crunch time, they reverted to Barry Trotz hockey. So it really depends on, who you're going to let go and who you're going to move based on the direction this team wants to go. If you want to get rid of this whole defensive only structure, you got to bring in speed and skill. If you're going to stick with this defensive structure, which I think doesn't make sense, you need, to me, the regular season and the playoffs are two different leagues.
Yep.
Two different sports. And you look at the teams they're like the New Jersey Devils, like speed is something that doesn't change. Even if the Devils are struggling to finish, they'll always have speed, which is hard to defend. The Islanders have Barzal fast and Engvall, who's a UFA that's probably going to command money. You don't have speed, but if you're not going to play that speed style of game, you're not going to drop a ton of money to get someone that's fast, So I really think,
you're probably never going to get beyond, maybe a surprise conference finals trip as well.
Exactly. And you look at all those years, right? Besides the year that they finished second in the Metro, they've barely gotten in. Their style of defense only wears you down during the regular season, where you'll get into the playoffs, but you're not getting smoothly on Barzal. Barzal talked about it as exit interviews. He goes, I don't want to have to be fighting at the end of the season to make the playoffs. I want to be looking at February and thinking, all right, we're good, And the Islanders haven't really had that. And that's something I think would help a lot in terms of, the injuries they always deal with and the age. I'm not saying this team is ridiculously old that people are playing out to, but, maybe they don't play as much down the stretch. They save some energy and all that stuff. I mean, these guys go into the playoffs all banged up and bruised, and they battle. We saw them battle to get to the semifinals. But again, it's wear and tear type of hockey, which again, I don't think works successfully for full 82. Like I said, the Islanders didn't play that way for the first half of the season, and they played to it to make the playoffs. But I just don't think it works.
Stefen, great stuff as always. I appreciate you making the time today. It'll be interesting to see. I think it's a team Penguins fans are going to feel the burr in their saddle for a while from the Islanders. They're going to be right there. It's just a question of, like they said, can they punch through to that next level? We'll be watching them this offseason to see what they try to pull off in order to do so. Great stuff again. Thanks as always for the time.
Thank you.
Great stuff as always from Stefen Rosner of the Hockey News, talking about the New York Islanders. And we go back out west now, all the way out west, to Andrew Knoll of the LA Daily News. He covers the Kings out there. And man, the last time we saw the Kings here in Pittsburgh, they were absolutely blowing the doors off the Penguins at a point in time where we were trying to figure out what the Penguins were. And it felt like we never really figured out what the Penguins were, at least on the bottom six. We know they're the superstars and then figure it out from there. What are the Kings? Because it feels like this is a team that's gotten away from the image and the personnel that helped drive those Stanley Cup titles a decade ago. And they're very much in search of their own identity, other than Anze Kopitar and a couple of the other vets that are still around, Doughty as well. It feels like this is a team maybe in search of an identity. What happened to them in the first round, Andrew?
Well, as far as the identity question is concerned, I think they're starting to find their identity. They went through a systems transformation that was pretty drastic. Once they settled on Todd McLaughlin in particular, I think the Sutter era kind of spilled over into the Stevens and Desjardins period, but Todd's put in a higher tempo, higher possession, a little bit more active system. They just didn't have the personnel to really make it work. So now they are a lot stronger offensive team, a lot stronger team on the power play, which for Kings fans is sort of a Twilight Zone moment. They've been futile on the power play even during the golden era. So yeah, that's starting to come around. And then on the flip side, they haven't had a lot of stability in net. So that's maybe made them seem like they've made this radical transformation into an offensive team.
Right.
I think it's just they've got to kind of make that last step to becoming a more comprehensive team instead of being a 2-1 game like they were, at their peak. And of course, they still have Kopitar, they still have Doughty. There's still some links there. But other than that, they didn't have a ton of experience. They didn't have a ton of, man's bodies. And I do think that they got pushed around a little bit against Edmonton and some of the other big teams in the West.
Yeah, second year in a row, pardon me, to go out against the Oilers. I don't think there's any shame in going out to the Oilers with all the talent on that roster, but how did they plan to stay with that team, and how did they fail to execute that plan, I guess, in a first round where, again, there's no shame in going out to the Oilers given the speed and the skill there, but how did they plan to slow it down, and then how did they fail to execute that?
Yeah, I think you touched on something important, that it really was a matchup type exit. I think they would have had a much better shot against really any of the other 6 qualifiers in the West.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond that, it was something of an arms race. I mean, we saw the Kings go out and get Fiala, who was a huge addition in the offseason. Then they, make the deal with Columbus, kind of check 2 boxes with one deal at the trade deadline. But Edmonton was pushing strongly too. I mean, they bring in Hyman and Kane last year. I mean, what perfect compliments to their big guns. Nugent Hopkins moves forward. Then at the deadline, they make, in my opinion, probably the best move that any team made, bringing in Matthias Ekholm, taking the totality of that circumstance into account. And that they get bigger up front too. I mean, these guys, Costin and, the acquisition of Bugstad. So, the Kings made a lot of strides to keep up with them. And then they made some more moves themselves. So it'll be interesting to see how that cat and mouse goes. Who has the cap space to keep making moves, who has the wherewithal to make the right ones, because I think the 2 teams are going to be chasing each other quite a bit in the Pacific Division.
What's the overall fan reaction to what they did at the deadline? Gavrikov, Korpisalo, you mentioned the Columbus deal. They're both unrestricted free agents now, though. Don't know if they have futures in LA or if they go out and test the market. Those are really the only big names that are unrestricted. I think Alexander Edler may be a free agent as well. But without much roster turnover forced by free agency this year, how do the fans feel about the moves that were made at the deadline and whether this is a team that can continue to compete going forward?
Well, fan sentiment is always a little bit of a tricky thing, but I would say the pulse would be more so that people were satisfied with Gavrikov and what he brought to the table. Definitely. He integrated himself really quickly. He had a strong series against Edmonton. And I think by and large, people want him back, both inside the fan base and inside the locker room. Drew Doughty's talked about that. Matt Roy, a number of guys on the team. With Korpisalo, it was a best goalie available move. And as you know, a lot of times it's really hard to get a goalie at the deadline. I remember 2019, the Sharks were really looking for one, and they had to settle with what they had. I mean, there are years where no roster goalies move, or something really cumbersome like the Fleury trade. So that they were able to get somebody in there to give them another option was a good thing. We'll see about the future. I think at this point they would like to bring him back because they don't really have another option. But if something comes along where maybe a guy is on an ELC or a bridge deal and they think he's a strong option for the future, that could happen. They do have Copley under contract for next season. But I think they would like to bring back both, and with Gavrikov probably being the higher priority.
So if they look at their roster right now, Andrew, and they say, okay, we're happy with what we have. We don't have a ton of cap space, but we're not looking at a ton of free agents leaving either. We'd like to prioritize Gavrikov if we could. I think you mentioned settling into what Todd McLellan wants them to do. So if Robitaille, Blake, McLellan are all happy with what they have, and they're going to push forward basically with what they had this year, what helps them make that next move or take that next leap? Or do they simply look at it, as you mentioned before, hey, it's a bad matchup. We got the Oilers in the first round. What'd you want us to do? Anybody else, we're talking about a second round series. Do they look at it more that way, or do they look at maybe making some surgical maneuvers rather than anything wide swathing?
Well, they better have them look at it that way because there's a great chance they'll be facing Edmonton again and again and again. I mean, the divisional setup really puts them on a collision course.
Yeah.
So I don't think that they're thinking, okay, how can we keep pace with Edmonton with every move? It's not that level of obsession, but they certainly can't think that, oh, well, we got a bad draw and we won't next time, because it's very likely these teams continue squaring off.
Right.
But on the flip side, I think they have a lot of built-in runway. If you look at it, this build has been very unconventional in the sense that you've got a couple ties to the veteran guys from the old teams, and then you've got a number of bridge players that they've brought in. But their top prospects really haven't made much of an impact yet. Quentin Byfield is starting to find his way. Arthur Kaliev has shown flashes. Alex Turcotte has missed considerable time to injury. Brant Clark is on the way. He had a hell of a season in junior and spent a little bit of time up with the Kings as well. So these are the guys that they were trading up for, that they were picking at the top of the draft. Really only Gabe Vilardi has started to materialize, and that was just this season. That's another thing they have to look at this offseason. He's an arbitration-eligible restricted free agent. So that's another thing that's probably going to prompt them to have to jettison a contract or two in order to accommodate the guys they want to bring back. But yeah, I think they're in a good position to continue improving without making any drastic moves.
So all that being said, if it should be a relatively quiet summer in LA, when we get to draft weekend at the end of June and then free agency a couple days later, what should we keep an eye out for the Kings and what they may do? What may be, if there's really very little to do, is it really just all about, like I said, the little surgical maneuvers of, hey, let's do what we can to re-sign Gavrikov and kind of move forward from there because we like what we have?
Number one thing they'll be looking at is their goalie situation in terms of both opportunities in the trade market and how to resolve the existing logjam that they would have if they brought in either another goalie or re-signed Korpisalo, because Cal Peterson is sort of the elephant in the room right now. $5 million cap hit, spent the majority of the season in the minors and did not perform particularly well at that level. So they were on the hook for 2 more years. That could be a real impediment to them. You can't just stash these guys in the AHL like in the past. I think he counted for over $4 million against the cap this season. So that's something that they've got to figure out, both in terms of improving the quality of their goaltending and resolving that situation. The draft, they've traded out of the first round this year and next. That has been, I think, a sign of progress for the organization. Before, they were just holding futures, really. And that was probably the prudent move. Now they're investing and tweaking the team. So, yeah, overall, I think you can see small moves. But in net, they've got a big question. And if there's an opportunity to answer it, get some resolution, they will definitely look to do that.
Andrew, great stuff. We appreciate you taking a couple of minutes. It's been nice to spin around absolutely everywhere, even though you guys, like I said, are all in the same boat now as Penguin fans. Our team's out of it. Right. But you're in Southern California, so you get to go outside and enjoy it. And we appreciate you taking the time to do it. We'll catch up with you again once we wind back around to the regular season.
My pleasure. Thank you, Chris.
Great stuff from Andrew Knoll of the LA Daily News on the Kings there. And we stay out west, but we go a whole heck of a lot farther north and bring it back this way just a little bit. Scott Billeck of the Winnipeg Sun joins me to talk about what I think may be, of all the teams we've talked about so far, and we've gone Bruins, Avs, Rangers, Isles, Lightning, all over the place. I think this is the most interesting situation of all 8 teams eliminated in the first round of the Stanley Cup playoffs. So thanks for making the time, Scott. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing good. Yeah, anytime. Yeah, and as north as it might be, it's pretty nice here today. So I'm not complaining. Yeah,
it's getting to be that time of year where it gets warm even in Manitoba. So let me ask you this. The reason the Jets are the most interesting situation of the 8 teams eliminated in the first round, to me anyway, is because of the myriad of questions that exist around all of the important personnel. Rick Bowness was very clear about how he felt about this team down the stretch and at the end of that first round series. The leadership of this team, the Wheelers, the Scheifeleys of the world, they were very clear that they were disappointed with themselves in some cases. This could be with the number of unrestricted free agents, at least in the bottom half of the roster, with Bonus's situation, with so much up in the air. This could be really a summer of upheaval in Winnipeg. So let's start with this. What failed them? Because there were times this year where they looked unstoppable, especially earlier in the year.
Yeah.
And then there were times down the stretch where it felt like they couldn't get anything right.
Yeah, they failed themselves, to be honest with you. Like, I mean, that's what failed. They failed themselves. Like, if you look at the first half of this season, you'll find a team that was up to January 15th of this year, first place in the Western Conference, like
Right.
above the Vegas Golden Knights. They had one of the best records in the league, obviously, at that point. I think at one point they were third in the NHL, maybe fourth, around that area in terms of their overall record. And they got there by playing a style of game that, you know, some context here. The Winnipeg Jets for the last few years have played a very much a game where it's like, okay, hopefully we can catch lightning in a bottle for 5 minutes in a game, score 3 goals, and walk away with a win, right? This year, Rick Bowness comes in and implements an actual system into this team that is predicated on hard work, aggressive forecheck, you know, activation of the defense, which, you know, seemed like this was this foreign, you know, concept before he came in this year. I mean, Rick Bowness turned Josh Morrissey, that's Freudian slip there, Josh Morrissey into a Norris candidate, right? And so, you know, that all that happened within the first half, you know, the first up to January 15th, let's say,
Right.
you know, right around the end of the new year, and right around the beginning of the new year, and so, you know, we see this team playing such a great brand of hockey. It's aggressive, it's heavy, it's speedy, you know, and they're playing to a lot of different strengths. They're getting great goaltending from Connor Hellebuyck, as they always do. And then it just ceases to exist. You know, like they ceased to play a winning style of hockey. And that's the biggest question mark, I think, on this whole year is why did they quit playing that way? It led them to a lot of wins. It led them to a lot of good feelings. It led them to, you know, career years for a lot of these guys, from Mark Scheifele scoring 42, cracking the 40-goal mark for the first time. Josh Morrissey, obviously, I mentioned earlier, career highs across the board. All these guys, like almost every guy in this team was either touching career highs in terms of, you know, like even like, let's say top 6 guys, that sort, or middle 6 guys. A lot of defensemen were coming out. Dylan DeMello turned into a goal scorer at times. Like there was a lot of things that happened, but they just stopped playing that brand of hockey, and I don't know why, and a lot of people here don't understand why, because it led them to wins, and then when they went on and they lost 9 of 11, they completely got away from that game. But part of that, they'd gotten away from that game earlier than that, and they were still winning games just on talent alone, and Connor Hellebuyck being as good as he can be at times. But then it was a struggle from that point on to find that game again. They found it the last month, 3 weeks of the season. They looked as good as they did before, and then their analytics were great. And then they hit the playoffs, played a tremendous game 1, right? Like that game 1 against Vegas was the exact blueprint. That is how they played in the first half of the season. And then they decided not to play that game again outside of the first period in game 2. You can call the pushback in game 3 to get it to overtime, whatever. Yeah, my point was they caught lightning in a bottle in that game, and that's the way that this team used to play. And so they fall back on these old habits and stuff like that. And at the end of the day, you know, they get bounced in 5 games. And yeah, it leads us to where we are now. We're going to be talking about guys like Mark Scheifele, Connor Hellebuyck, Blake Wheeler, Pierre-Luc Dubois, who may not even be here next year. And this team had something in that first half of the year, and they let it slip.
So how do they reconcile all of this? A team, including the leadership group, who failed each other down the stretch, with a head coach who let them know that they were failing each other very clearly. And now they're all supposed to walk back into the same room this fall?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing because, I mean, Rick Bowness came out after game 5, and everybody's seen it now. 56 seconds, I believe it was, of pure being he was pissed off, right? I mean, he was mad. I think there was a lot of air let out there from that had built up. I mean, he said it, and you could see it during the last half of the season. Like, Rick has never been a guy who has hid his emotions. I think, though, during the second half of the year when they were going, he had to coddle is an interesting word, but, you know, there was times where he had to more hold your hand than get, be the angry dad or the disappointed grandpa or whatever, right? Like he couldn't do that because I don't think you were getting the response. He saw what happened after he benched Mark Scheifele in Carolina. Mark Scheifele didn't play very well for the next 9 or 10 games, and that's a problem in and of itself. And you could spend a long time on Mark Scheifele and the way that he's played over the last few years. But it's just one of those things where I think he let it out. And it was interesting because we get to the garbage bag day interviews on the Saturday. They got bounced on Thursday. They did the garbage bag days on the following Saturday, 2 days later.
Mm-hmm.
And you sort of expect somebody to come in there and say, hey, we might not have liked what Rick said, but that's not the problem here. The problem is it was us. We didn't perform at a level. To a man, not one of them said it, right? And that's a bigger problem, in my opinion, is that the accountability is not there. And it's just like there was the joke around here was there was more pushback in that garbage bag day interviews than there was in Game 5, for sure. In a large part of this season, right? And so it created this weird thing. Rick Bowness was not supposed to speak on Saturday. He came. They changed that at the last minute after he got thrown under the bus by 13 or 14 guys that day. He comes out and he kind of has to, and so he walked back the word disgusted. He'd rather not have had that one. But here's my problem, and we've all been watching the playoffs. You watch what happened with Rod Brindamore after Game 3 in Carolina, where they got rolled 8-4, and Brindamore gets upset at the team. And what does Carolina do? They respond, right? They respond and come out in that game. After that game, New Jersey head coach Lindy Ruff comes out and railroads his team too. And then you have Nico Hischier come out, and I think Damon Severson came out too. And they're like, that's unacceptable. And that's just something that you would like to see around here in Winnipeg. When Boston got bounced in the first round, I mean, that's a huge upset. But Brad Marchand comes out and owns it, right? I mean, guys like that come out and own it. We didn't see that here in Winnipeg, and that's a big problem.
So where does it go from here? If it's not a breakup of the boys, right? If it's the same room coming back, the same group playing for bonus. Unfortunately for the rest of the league anyway, fortunately for Jets fans, that probably means Connor Hellebuck isn't going anywhere. And it gives them an opportunity to try and run it back under bonus one more time. But again, with that dynamic that exists now, do some of the big names, some of the leadership pieces have to go out, and can they necessarily pull that off this summer?
Yeah, I mean, it's a monumental task this offseason for Kevin Cheveldayoff, the general manager of the Jets here. I think they can shed a guy like Mark Scheifele and Blake Wheeler and still be okay. A part of that is I think, that changes the culture and the leadership completely in this room, in this dressing room. I think it opens the door for a bunch of different guys to I think Jets fans would hope would change the culture from within through of course the next couple of years. But one thing that a lot of these guys said at the end of the year was they don't want to be here for a rebuild, and honestly, there's not really an appetite in this town for one. Season ticket sales have dwindled. It's been a big issue here. There some nights this year they're down 2,300 fans at times. That's not a good thing for the second smallest, and you can't really Mullet's the smallest, obviously, in Arizona, not really an NHL rink. So for the smallest NHL size rink here in the league, I mean, this is a team that needs it sold out every night. And so, but how do you sell? This is the thing. Like, if you're not going to trade Connor Hellebuck, you got to sign him to an extension.
Right.
And I think the Jets would do that in a heartbeat. You're also going to make him the top paid goalie in the league, in my opinion, because Andrei Vasilevsky is making what he's making. I think Sergei Bobrovsky is also up in the $10 million. But those guys are playing in tax-free states that you don't get that affordability here in Manitoba. So Connor Hellebuck's probably making north of 10 on some sort of extension. And then you got Pierre-Luc Dubois, and I think if you could get Pierre-Luc Dubois to stay and commit to this city, I think you can get rid of Mark and Blake, and you don't have to worry about it really at all. You're going to lose the goal scoring, but the team is going to completely change under a different. I think Pierre-Luc Dubois would be obviously in the running for a captaincy at that point. It would be a different team. But yeah, it's interesting, and the problem is the vision, at least on the outside. We haven't seen it. Fans haven't seen the vision of this club. We don't really know what this team is kind of looking to do, where it's heading. And I understand part of with players and stuff like that. You're not going to know right at the end of the year if you're re-signing guys or whatever. There's negotiations, all that stuff, but there's not a lot of hope in Winnipeg right now. And Kevin Cheveldayoff, he spent 42 minutes on Sunday, on the Sunday after the day after the players spoke, and he answered one question in 42 minutes, and that was, would Rick Bowness be back? And he, after going on for a little bit, he finally said yes. And so that's what fans have to go with this summer. And I think there is hope that this team does move out guys like Blake Wheeler and Mark Scheifele because of some of the on-ice stuff. Because Blake Wheeler and his cap hit and Father Time is still undefeated, and Blake is he's getting up there. He'll be 37 next season, and the cap space that would open up if they were able to move at least half of his contract or buy him out, which would open up more. But these are decisions because this team is very loyal. This is a team that still nominated Blake Wheeler for the King Clancy this year. I'm not sure this team wants to get rid of Blake Wheeler, and he's got one more year left on his contract, but there's a lot of loyalty to Blake Wheeler. He was the captain of the team. I understand that they stripped the captaincy from the beginning of the year, but at the same time, he was still the de facto leader in that room. And so, yeah, I wish I could tell you what was going to happen, but I don't know, because I think there's still very much the possibility that they try and run this back just as much as there's a possibility of them trying to, retool on the fly. And I don't think we're going to really know the answer to that until we get closer to the draft and see what, but not, who are you trading Mark Scheifele? Like, who are you trading Mark Scheifele to? What are you getting back? Are you getting back a center? Probably not. Connor Hellebuyck, what's he getting you in a return? I mean, it would be pretty good, but again, it's probably going to be some top caliber prospects and maybe a pick. I don't know if you're getting like a top center, right? What you need to replace potentially Mark Scheifele and Pierre-Luc Dubois. So,
and good luck making the cap space work on all of these prospective deals for both sides as well. Yeah. Man, great stuff, Scott. Like I said, I think we saved the best for last because it's the most fascinating situation of the 8 teams that were eliminated in the first round. I appreciate you making the time today. It's going to be something, like you said, I think draft weekend will be the sort of hinge point in the summer and the off season for the Winnipeg Jets to see where it goes from here. But thanks again for making the time from up north. We appreciate it. And we'll catch up again once the regular season starts.
Yeah, for sure. I appreciate it, guys. Thanks for having me.
Great stuff from Scott Billeck of the Winnipeg Sun. I'll say it again. The Jets are going to be fascinating to watch this offseason if you're a fan of the NHL. Even if you're just a Penguin-specific fan, think of the different targets you may have in mind from that roster if the Jets decide, and it sounds like they're going to run it back, more likely to run it back, but if they decide to tear it down. And certainly goaltender would be at the top of the list, although, again, cap space is the problem here. How on earth would the Penguins find the cap space to trade for a Connor Hellebuyck and then re-sign a Connor Hellebuyck? Maybe just a pipe dream. Maybe. We will continue as the playoffs continue to talk to all of the teams that get eliminated, or people who cover the teams anyway. And as the draft approaches towards the end of June, we'll talk to those lottery teams that are picking high. And of course, keep an eye on what the Penguins may be doing in their front office search as well. All you got to do, subscribe inside your Odyssey app, AUDACY, or wherever you get your podcasts, or go to YouTube, 93.7 The Fan on YouTube, and subscribe there to get the latest videos, because we do this as a video as well. Fifth Avenue Faceoff. Every single week, we'll keep the episodes coming to you so you get the latest content on both the playoffs and the Penguins off season right here on Fifth Avenue Faceoff.